So we left off talking about market share, the different measures. One thing I wanted to kind of highlight from last class, so I mentioned something about when we calculate this HHI, that if you have market shares as a proportion, then at the very end, you would have to multiply by 10,000. Any example I give you on the exam or anything that we'll work through in the class, you'll have market share as a percent, so you don't have to worry about doing that multiplication by 10,000. All you have to do is take each market share, whatever the percentage is, and square it, and then add them all up for every industry. Also, I want to kind of highlight when we're thinking about the concentration ratios, these are always only looking at the top 4 firms. So sometimes this will even be referred to as the 4-firm concentration ratio. But for the HHI, you are squaring the market share of every single firm. Okay. So we kind of threw these on up there and kind of show you these in the last class. So I'm going to take a slightly different turn here today. I'm going to introduce something that won't be on this upcoming exam. Right? So we're going to start introducing the next topic, but it's a little bit lengthy of a topic. So I want to try to start working through some of the basics and kind of the building blocks today and Friday, but also sprinkle in some stuff that we could see on the exam. So I'll work through some new stuff, right? And at a certain point, I think the last 10, maybe 15 minutes, I have kind of a pretty big kind of real world kind of application of some of the market structure stuff that we've been talking about. So I'll make sure I mention when I'm transitioning the kind of material that we are kind of reviewing for a little bit for the exam. Right? Also for that exam, I have it written, so I know what it looks like. I'm a little bit worried that there's like a little bit more than half the class here today. But for sure, next Monday, we'll be doing some review for that. I would highly, highly, highly encourage to show up for that. I'm honestly probably going to use the iClickers not for points on Monday, but just to see who's here and probably look at things like correlations between exam scores and being at the review. I think that might be an interesting kind of thing to look at. Okay? But in terms of preparing for it, you've got those 2 set of practice problems, right? Those are going to be problems that would look similar to the types of problems that I would ask you on the exam. That 4th kind of homework that's sitting out there, being able to make sure you understand all of those questions, because that would be some really good preparation for the exam as well. And then after that, if you're really comfortable with those 2, I would go back to the slides. I've got all the completed slides other than this week's up under that old lectures folder on Canvas. And anything that has like iClicker on it, make sure you know how you could solve those problems. Okay? Any questions for me before we kind of get going here into material? Trying to give us a little bit of a roadmap for like this next week. Right? So I really like this topic. So this is one of my, I took this courses all the way through grad school in this area, which is game theory, right? So game theory is really applicable, not just in economics, but political science. They use it a lot. You really can apply it to almost anything where you have people making decisions, okay? So we're going to start out, right? And we can kind of put this in the context of these oligopolies we talked about. I'll show you other examples, but it does relate to kind of what we left off with talking about these like duopolies or oligopolies, a very small number of firms. So ultimately, or, in the end, we're going to end up getting to this point where we have what we call a Nash equilibrium. Okay? So a Nash equilibrium is going to be when you have 2 parties and they're optimally responding to the other person's decision. Okay? So basically just both parties involved are making the best decision in response to the other person's best decision. And we'll walk through what this kind of looks like, but just kind of give a definition there. If you hadn't watched it, sometimes, less in this class, my stats class, I give a lot of movies. I don't know why. I should mention more than you guys. But this one's great. It's kind of an older movie now, but if you haven't seen A Beautiful Mind, really, really good movie about a real story about the guy who really revolutionized kind of game theory. Kind of shows how brilliant he was, but also maybe flawed. So there's a little bit of a lead into that movie. But what we're going to do with these game theory examples is we're going to have 2 players who are making decisions. We can have more than 2 players. It complicates the models a little bit. And I might show you one. I'm only going to expect you know how to solve one that has 2 players involved. Okay? We can't add more, but we'll kind of keep it at 2 for us. What is going to end up changing the games a little bit is also when the decisions are made. So we'll start out today. We're just going to be looking at games where decisions are made simultaneously. Right? Kind of one of the age-old examples we see for game theory is like the game of chicken. I don't know if like when two people are running at each other, you both have a decision to make. You can both go left. It's not going to end well. You both go right. It doesn't end well. It's optimal for one person to go left, one person to go right. Right. So we've got two players. They've got decisions to be made. Just about. Well, so we've got what we then call strategies, right? These decisions about do I go left, do I go right? Those are my decisions. I'll show you examples where we have more than two, but for us, typically we're going to kind of keep this at two decisions, right? So two players, they've got two decisions to make. That's why the game of chicken is perfect for this, right? Either go left or right. And both people kind of have to make that decision simultaneously. We then have what we're going to look at are the payoffs. Right? I already kind of mentioned the payoffs in the game of chicken. We both go left. The payoff is we're both in a world of hurt. We both go right. The payoff is bad. Right? We're both in a world of hurt. We go opposite directions. Well, now the payoff is good. Right? So we think about these decisions that people are making are going to lead to different payoffs. And if we assume people want something that has the highest payoff, right? And this might not just be monetarily, right? We could build in like the value, like not just giving someone money, but giving someone something that they value highly, right? So we're then going to look at the benefits to each player from these different combinations of these actions, right? Based off which strategy the players chose. Okay? Now what I'll start doing is we'll break this down. And if you can envision it, like good on you. I have to write these down when I'm doing this game theory stuff. So we're going to look at a 2x2 matrix. Okay? So draw a box, put a line in the middle, and horizontally and vertically. What we're going to do is, do I have one here? Yeah, I'll go back to the other slide in a second. So we're going to label kind of each side, the top and then the left side. Here's something like, here's firm, I just want to match up. Is it firm one's here? Yeah. Firm one and firm two. Okay? They have decisions to make. What are their decisions? We'll label their decisions as kind of the row and column headings. Okay? So firm one can either set a high price for the good they're selling, or they can set a low price. Firm two can do a similar thing. Now, in practice, we could actually make this matrix like every single dollar amount that they could set the price at, but that gets complicated quick. So like we're starting out with just two options, and we'll just call it low and high. If you want to put a value of, $50, $20. So they're setting a price for this good. Now I have it up here. I kind of drew these like diagonals. That's a way you'll often see these game theory examples represented. Another way that you can do it, and I typically, if I do something like in the final exam, or I give you different questions, I typically instead will just use a comma and put firm one's payoff here and firm two's payoff here. So firm one's payoff, comma, firm two's payoff. Right? And then you kind of do that for each one of these different blocks. Right? Now, these payoffs in practice will be an actual value, right? So for a firm, these payoffs are probably writing, okay, what's the profit that each firm makes if they both set a high price? What's the profit each firm makes if they both set a low price? And then kind of what if we have a different combination of the payoffs there as well? Okay? So, our players, firm one, firm two, those kind of are how we label that. How we're labeling the top, and then kind of the left-hand side. And each one of those firms has two decisions. They can set either a low or a high price. That's how we kind of label the row and columns of our 4x4 or our 2x2 matrix, or our 4 boxes. Right? So let's maybe put some actual values to this. We can determine, well, what's the optimal decision for these firms to do? We kind of know in the context of firms, like if we're both setting a high price, that might be good. But if the other person sets a high price, like firm two sets a high price, but I set a low price, well, now everyone's going to buy more from me. Right? And so we can start to think about maybe there's some incentives, right, to choose different strategies, but what's the optimal strategy? Or where do we end up in the long run? So that's what game theory helps us do. We'll say that if, regardless of what the other person does, it's always optimal for firm one to do something, we'll call that a dominant strategy. So regardless of what the other player does, if it's always optimal for me to choose the same strategy, we call that a dominant strategy. So I can probably think of an example of that. So like, let's say instead of a game of chicken, it's kind of like things that are unrelated. So perhaps this is something like, if I'm running and there's a pole in front of me and you're running alongside of me, right? But 20 feet from me. Right? Well, you've got a pole in front of you as well. You can go left or you can go right. Well, now we're far enough away where we're not going to run into each other. So it's always optimal for me to kind of go whichever way is going to avoid the pole, right? I have a dominant strategy. It doesn't matter what you do. You can do whatever is best for you. It's always going to be optimal for me to kind of go left or go, whichever direction avoids that pole or avoids the wall or whatever. Now, we'll kind of see that when we have actual profit values in here. Sometimes it might always be optimal for firms to set a low price, regardless of what the other person does, or what the other firm does. So if both players have a dominant strategy, we say that, we kind of can identify what that Nash equilibrium is. Right? If it's always good for me to do one thing, and it's always good for you to do, your thing, we both have dominant strategies, well, then we're always going to end up in that same equilibrium, that same combination strategy. Because we're both going to do what's best for us. Prisoner's dilemma refers to these games in which, if we could cooperate, right, we could both be better off. But unfortunately, right, there's always a tendency we might have dominant strategies that lead us to do other things. So this really kind of closely ties into those oligopoly models we were talking about last class, where if firms decided to both choose low quantities of production, we said they could kind of have monopoly power. Right? But there was always this dominant strategy of it was always good to be the person who set the lower price. And so those dominant strategies kind of led us into the situation where both parties break the agreement, and then they're back to basically setting price equal to marginal cost, and profits are back to zero. So there's this idea, that's the idea of a prisoner's dilemma. So I think I've got an example here. Yeah, so we'll start building this out. I'm not having to erase it. Well, I might have to sneak over another class real quick. Be right back. I don't know who steals erasers, but there's a special place in hell. So let's say we've got this example where I have to remember the names and stuff like this. So we've got Dan and Joe, two people suspected in a bank robbery. They only have enough evidence to imprison each of them for 5 years if they don't confess. Right? So let's think about our two players. We've got Dan and Joe. And they're being held in kind of question about a robbery. So we've got, there are two strategies, right? So we've got two players, and they each have two strategies. They can confess or they don't confess. Right? So this is kind of going to line up with that here, what prisoners dilemma. So if they both don't confess, so they don't like snitch on each other, they both get 5 years in prison. Now here it's going to be a little bit weird because the payoffs, the numbers we're writing in, the higher the number, the worse it is for the person, right? You want the lowest number of years of in jail, kind of like a low scoring golf or something like that. So we've got kind of one of these payoff kind of block boxes in our matrix filled out. Right? They both don't confess. If they put each of them in separate rooms and they're making simultaneous decisions about whether or not they can confess, if one of them confesses, the other person doesn't, they go free, right? And the other person gets 25 years, okay? So if Dan confesses, right, he's gonna go scot-free, snitches on Joe, Joe, oh, sorry, I'm going the wrong block. Sorry, Dan confesses, Joe doesn't. Right? So Dan's going to go free, 0 years in jail. But Joe, the second player here, is going to get 25 years. The reverse would also be true, right? If Joe confesses, snitches on Dan, but Dan doesn't confess, right, then Dan's going to get 25 years, but Joe gets to go free. Is that clear on the right side? Any questions on this up to this point? Right, so we have got one more of these combinations of strategies to fill in. If they both confess, right, they both kind of snitch on each other, they give up even more information about this robbery, maybe implicate themselves in more crimes. Neither of them go free, and they both get 10 years in jail. So we've got this kind of matrix, and I could fill all this in. Right? I like to kind of work through it on the board. I could write it using these diagrams. Like I said, I think this makes a little more sense. Where you always, just because the ordering will always make sense. Person one, their payoffs will always be first. Person two, their payoffs will always be second. Here, I don't know, it gets a little bit weird. Like, okay, the lower triangle is Joe, or the upper triangle is Dan. And you can put either player on either side. It doesn't matter here if I would have flip-flopped Joe and Dan like I did here in the slides. We'll always end up determining the equilibrium is exactly the same. So it doesn't matter exactly which side you put each person on, as long as whatever side you put them on, you make sure you put their payoffs in the correct spot. And I think kind of using this comma format makes a lot more sense. But honestly, like if you look at the book or you look at kind of other resources, a lot of times you'll see these game theory matrices written or displayed kind of in this way. All right, so that's why I'm showing you. I think it makes a little more sense to write them like this person. So we've got this kind of normal form game depicted. Right? I think I've got here. I'll show you how we kind of, I've got the equilibrium here, but I want to show you how we arrive at it. I think it makes a little sense when we use the board here. I think we've got colors. I think I have an idea of how to use these colors to make a little more sense. So let's say that Dan is red. What you're going to go through and do is determine what Dan's best response is to what Joe does. Now, Joe can do two things. So we're going to have to determine what Dan's best response is to each of those things. So if Joe confesses, right, this is no longer an option. Right? If Joe confesses, then for Dan, the only two scenarios left are right here. Right? So Joe's confessing. If Dan confesses, he gets 10 years in prison. If he doesn't confess, he gets 25. So which do you think is optimal for him to do? Yeah, right? If he knows, like, this is kind of a hypothetical, right? If he knew Joe was confessing, it's optimal for him to confess because he gets lower jail time. If instead Joe doesn't confess, now we're kind of left only with these two outcomes. What is it optimal for Dan to do? Confess or not confess? Well, Joe's not confessing. If Dan confesses, he gets 0 years. If he doesn't confess, he gets 5. So what is it optimal for Dan to do here? Yeah, right? It goes free. Flip side, now this is like exact same payoff, so this doesn't seem as interesting. In other examples, maybe the other person has slightly different payoffs here. So now let's determine what Joe's optimal decisions are. So Joe, right? If Dan decides to confess, Joe's essentially living in these two worlds up here at the top. So if Dan decides to confess, what is it optimal for Joe to do? Confess, right? He gets 10 years instead of 25. If Dan doesn't confess, what's optimal for Joe to do? Well, if he confesses, he gets 0 years. If he doesn't confess, he gets 5. Right? So all I've done there is kind of underline what each player's best response is to the other player's choices, right? And both choices, right? I went through and what was Dan's best response when Joe confessed? What was Dan's best response when Joe didn't confess? And then vice versa. So when I underline these optimal decisions, anytime I have a combination of strategies where both people are best responding to what the other person's doing, we call that our Nash equilibrium. So just kind of like to kind of maybe not the most, I don't know, technically correct way. But if we're underlining these, a good way to identify this Nash equilibrium is just any box that you have two payoffs underlined, right? But what those underlines mean is basically that each person is making the best response to the other person's actions. And that's the definition of a Nash equilibrium. We're both best responding to each other's best response. So you can kind of see we end up in this situation where both people have this dominant, both people have this dominant strategy, right? No matter what Joe did, it was always optimal for Dan to confess. And no matter what Dan did, it was always optimal for Joe to confess. They had dominant strategies. Right? So we end up in this scenario where they both get 10 years of jail time, whereas if they were good people and didn't snitch on each other, they both would have only gotten 5. Right? So this is what we call a prisoner's dilemma. If they somehow could have cooperated and stuck true to that agreement, both people would be better off. Right? There was a combination of strategies where both of them were better off. Questions on that? Now I'll kind of give you a little bit more support as to why. So I'm going to erase these underlines, but does everybody have this? If you are kind of writing down here. So I'll try to give you an idea about why maybe this cooperation doesn't occur. So let's say that we're currently in this world where they both aren't confessing. Okay? So they both currently, if everything stays the same, they're both only going to get 5 years of jail time. But the cops are talking to Dan and they say, look, if you're the one that confesses, instead of both getting 5 years, if you decide to confess, right, Dan goes from not confessing to confessing. He instead is going to only get 0. So if we're starting out, we're in this better outcome for both people, there's an incentive, sorry, Dan was red, for Dan to be the one that confesses if he thinks that Joe is going to stay tight to their agreement, not to tell him Joe. But the problem is, right, so Dan has that incentive, but the problem is for Joe, if we're in this scenario, he goes, man, I really like Dan, but if he stays true to the agreement and I confess, right, Joe goes from not confessing to confessing, well, then I'm going to go scot-free. So there's this incentive, even if we start out in this combination of strategies where both people are better off than that Nash equilibrium point, there's incentives pulling both of them to kind of break that agreement. Right? And because both of them have incentive to break the agreement, they both end up confessing, and then we end up kind of back in that Nash equilibrium. Right? Now, how can we change this? Well, maybe if people value their friendships more than they kind of value jail time, maybe we don't have this scenario. But assuming that people are somewhat self-interested, right, there's always going to be this incentive to be the one who's kind of confessing this crime and going free. So we've got this Nash equilibrium where they both confess to the crime. It's not good. So we end up kind of seeing they both had a dominant strategy. For Joe, it was to always confess. For Dan, it was to always confess. So we end up in this Nash equilibrium where both of them confess to the crime. They both get 10 years, even though, right, it would have been better if they could have remained silent and kind of stuck to an agreement and both not confessed and only got 5 years. I think that's all I have here. So we've got our Nash equilibrium. Any questions there? And that's just kind of outlining what I was saying as I was working through the board. Right? We end up in this scenario that's worse for both players involved. Okay. Any questions on that? Yeah.
So the prisoner's dilemma always ends if they have equilibrium.
So if a prisoner's dilemma exists, right, then we're in a Nash equilibrium that is worse off for both parties. So the prisoner's dilemma is a byproduct of the fact that we have a Nash equilibrium existing that's worse off than kind of some other combination strategies. But any game we have, yeah, in order for there to be a prisoner's dilemma, we have to have a Nash equilibrium. There are some games where there's not necessarily an equilibrium. They're kind of weird games. I don't think I'll have any examples today for sure. Maybe Friday I'll introduce one where it doesn't matter. Let me think. There's an example. There's examples where there's two Nash equilibriums. We can kind of envision those. So let me make sure what else I have here. So we can, I'll touch on that on Friday. Or if we have time today. But I'll show you an example where we could have two Nash equilibriums. It's an example that I kind of already did. It's kind of a stupid one, I guess, in the context of, so you can kind of imagine here, this prisoner's dilemma. I was using like this jail time example. The next thing I'm going to go into is kind of basically do the exact same game, but the payoffs are going to be profits for companies, right? And this was the idea, if they could stick true to an agreement, the idea like not confessing, well, that was the idea if we could stick true to our collusion agreement and produce a lower quantity, right? And so you kind of see, even though we're kind of playing around with some kind of toy, they seem like, not games that are going to be very applicable to life. This prisoner's dilemma, the jail time is very, right, applicable to kind of that oligopoly model that we talked about with collusion agreements last class. So this game will also seem very trivial, but there's potentially real world, companies might be making decisions that would be very similar. It's just like the payoffs would be profits instead of whatever we're looking at. So let's say, I don't know, let's use Dan and Joe. So I can go right, go left, Joe can go right, Joe can go left, right? So this is this idea of this chicken game, right? So if we both go right, everything's fine. We go on. No, sorry, we both go right, everything's not fine. Sorry. We both go right, we hit each other, right? We're running toward each other and we both go right. So we'll say, I don't know, maybe I have to go to the hospital. So they both have $1,000 in hospital bills. If they both go left, right, they've got these huge hospital bills. My one's, so $1,000, right? Negative $1,000. If Joe goes right and I go left, everything's great. If I go right and Joe goes left, everything's great, right? There's no benefit, there's no cost either. So if I think about optimal decisions here, for Dan, if Joe goes right, what's optimal for Dan to do? Go left or go right? Yeah, go left, right? Go the opposite way, so you don't run into each other. If Joe's going left, is it optimal for Dan to go right or left? Go right. Then we do the flip side. It's easy enough, but if Dan is deciding to go right, what's optimal for Joe to do? Go right or go left? Go left. If Dan's going left, what's optimal for Joe to do? Go right or go left? Go the opposite way, go right. So this would be a situation where we've got two Nash equilibriums, right? In both scenarios, each player is best responding to what the other person does. Intuitively, in a game of chicken, the best response is if you knew what the other person was going to do, to go the other way, right? Now, we don't know which way that person might necessarily go ahead of time, but if we knew what the payoffs were, and we could somehow coordinate our actions, we could end up in either one of these outcomes, and we'd both be best responding to each other. Right? So there are some games that have two Nash equilibriums. There are some games that have no Nash equilibriums, right? Off the top of my head, let me think if I can think of the ones that don't have that. So there's chicken, if I have payoffs. So I'll say this now because I don't have an example prepared. And I'll bring one next class because it's a really good question. But what's going to be true if there isn't a Nash equilibrium is that we have games where there's no dominant strategy. Right? So that what I'm choosing to do is not going to be the same if the other player changes their decision. Right? So when we have no Nash equilibrium, these would be scenarios where we have dominant strategies that kind of don't want to. yeah, we can't have dominant strategies if there's no Nash equilibrium. But here I'm looking at the example, right? Should be an example where we have dominant strategies, so that's why we ended up in that Nash equilibrium. That then was an example of a privileged one. And here we have an example where potentially there's two Nash equilibriums in some of these games. Right? So my best response sometimes depends on what the other person does. The game of chicken is a perfect example for that. My best response is to always do the opposite of the other person does. Any questions kind of even how I solve this? I know I kind of solved this one a little bit quicker, but really I'm just identifying both players' best responses to all the other strategies the other person could choose. And then wherever we have kind of each party best responding to each other, each firm or each player, and that's where we said we would have this Nash equilibrium. Questions? Any more questions about it? Yeah. So let me see here. I think I've got one that's kind of interesting. I'll save the oligopoly stuff for, yeah, I'll save this stuff for Friday. But we'll work through this one here. Oh, let me see if I got another one. Oh, this one's kind of interesting. We'll start out with this one. So let's try to build out this normal form game and kind of determine what our equilibrium is here. So luckily, we're free of the political season for a little bit here. But whenever we have kind of an upcoming election, right? I don't know, like all the campaign ads that you kind of hear on the radio or see on TV, they're running between like that. I say TV, sometimes in halftime I'm seeing them on YouTube or something like that. Right? So let's say we've got two candidates. You can kind of imagine we can just line this up with R and D. You can imagine Republican, Democratic candidates. Right? So they're running against each other. They can choose two things. They can run a negative campaign ad, or we'll call it positive, but basically just not trashing the other person. Right? So both candidates have this decision to make, right? So we're kind of keeping this simplistic. Two players, two outcomes. Or sorry, two players, two strategies. So if the Republican candidate runs a negative ad attacking the Democrat, 3,000 fewer people will vote for the Democratic candidate, 1,000 of those people will vote for the Republican, and the rest will kind of not vote, right? So if they run a negative campaign ad, right, the other person loses 3,000 votes. So the Republican runs a negative campaign ad, and so does the Democrat, right? Well, they both lose 3,000 votes and kind of gain 1,000. So you kind of think about maybe they're just basically forcing people not to vote. Right? So the negative campaign ad makes 3,000 people say, I'm not going to vote for the candidate anymore. 1,000 of them switched it over to the other candidate. 2,000 kind of just stop voting altogether. Now, if they're both running negative campaign ads, those kind of benefits offset each other, right? I'm no longer getting that additional 1,000 because I'm getting the additional 1,000 from my opponent, but I'm also losing 3,000 because he ran or she ran a negative campaign ad as well. Right? So both people in that scenario are going to be out 2,000 votes. Right? Now, if the Republican runs the negative campaign ad, but the Democrat doesn't, well, then the Republican is going to get that additional, actually here, I should stop using commas for the actual value, might get confused, right? The Republican is going to get the additional 1,000, and the candidate who decided to remain positive just loses a bunch of votes. Same kind of idea here. The Democrat runs the negative campaign ad, the Republican doesn't, right? Runs this positive one. Well, now the Republican loses 1,000 votes, and the Democrat picks up 1,000. This is the whole idea of like running negative campaign ads. You're trying to convince people to stop voting for that candidate and instead vote for you. Right? So it's always good to be the one that's running the negative campaign ad if the other person isn't, right? So if the Democrat's running the negative campaign ad, the Republican's not, the Democrat is better off and they can hurt their opponent. If they both remain positive, you kind of think about nothing changes. Like no one changes their vote. I mean, we're simplifying this down a little bit, right? There's like issues, you know, they're actually talking about the issues and things. Maybe they convince some people that can change their decision. But this is the general idea, right? So if I'm going through here, if the Republican runs a negative campaign ad, what's optimal for the Democrat to do? So if they run a negative campaign ad, they lose 2,000 votes. But if they just remain positive, they don't attack the other person, they're going to lose 3,000, right? Because like it's almost like they're not defending themselves, they're not trying to like be combative. So their best response is to also run a negative campaign. If the other candidate remains positive, well, then what's optimal for that Democrat to do? Yeah, so if the Republican's running a positive campaign ad, if the Democrat remains positive, they don't gain any votes. If they run a negative campaign ad against their opponent, they'll gain 1,000. So if I'm trying to win this election, then I want more votes. Now, maybe we could build into this like some moral, you know, moral concerns or something. But if we're purely concerned about winning this election, we're just concerned about votes, this would be that Democrat's best response. Well, what about the Republican? Right? If the Democrat chooses to run negative campaign ads, what's optimal for the Republican to do? Run negative campaign ads or run a positive campaign ad? Well, a smaller negative number is better. Right? Losing 2,000 is better than losing 3,000 votes. What if the Democrat candidate remains positive? What's optimal for the Republican to do here? If they run a negative ad, they get 1,000. If they run a positive ad, they get no extra votes. So you kind of see here, the Democrat has a dominant strategy, right? It's always optimal for them to choose to run that negative campaign ad. The Republican also has a dominant strategy. No matter what the Democrat's doing, they should always run a negative campaign ad. Now, obviously, like some of these numbers could change, and not every election is it going to be optimal for both sides to run these negative ads. But that's why you see that like all they do is attack the other person a lot of the time, because quite often the payoffs are going to be something similar to this, in which there's always a dominant strategy to be running that negative, or the best response to what the other person is doing is always to be the one who's running that negative campaign. And kind of think, oh, this is a prisoner's dilemma, because both people would be better off if we just remain positive. Neither of us will lose any votes, right? Now, it's also, you can kind of imagine, we haven't talked about this yet, but there's an idea of externalities that people outside of the two people making decisions here are also hurt by this, right? Because if they both remain positive, we basically have 4,000 more people voting in our election. Right? We don't just have people abstaining, that are not going to the polls. Okay? So I think I've got another visual here, right? You can kind of, I think this is, maybe I should have, I thought this looked really nice at one point in time, but then I realized like having all this in here and like gaining and losing, it's a lot easier to look at the numbers, like having a positive or a negative and just kind of comparing those values. So here's a nice pretty version of it. Here's one that's probably a little bit more easy to understand, okay? But, however we want to write this out, we always end up kind of determining that it's always going to be the Nash equilibrium for these candidates to run these negative campaigns. So so here's kind of our summary there, right? So, we ended up in this scenario where they both lost the same number of votes. So the election result didn't really change from running these negative campaign ads, right? By both running, we kind of offset each other's negative campaigns, and we just caused people not to vote, right? We both lost 2,000 voters. I would argue that maybe some of this we see at the presidential elections as well. We just see people that kind of not showing up once it starts to get really, really ugly. I think we'll talk about cooperation in this class. So I wanted to go through an example. It's a little bit of exam review, and just something that I kind of find. So has everybody got this? Can I erase this? Okay. So this would be some stuff that you could see on the exam Wednesday. So week from. So let's think about a model where I've got a monopolist, right? So here's my monopolist marginal cost, and this is the demand curve that they're facing. I guess some of what I'm going to say is going to be true for monopolists and competitive markets as well. So what is my marginal revenue curve going to look like for a monopolist or a monopolistically competitive market? Yeah. Downward sloping, but there's even something else I can say about it relative to the demand curve. Yeah, so it's going to be twice as steep, right? Or the slope is twice as large, right? It's negative, so it's actually a larger negative value. So where's my optimal quantity decision? For every firm, regardless of market type, the optimal quantity is chosen where, get this tattooed or something before the exam on it, so you can always have it, right? Where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue, that's where we set that optimal quantity. Okay? How do we then determine what the price is going to be? Well, at that quantity, the demand curve tells us the marginal benefit to the consumer of that last unit produced. Whatever that person's marginal benefit is, they're willing to pay up to that amount. So I know that I could set the equilibrium price wherever I'm at on the demand curve at that point. Okay? Let's kind of review there. We then said, okay, relative. So I'm going to actually put, this is my monopolist. If we think about where the allocative efficient point is, so we'll call this QAE, and then, right? So allocated efficient point was what we said would exist if we had a perfectly competitive market. So with a monopolist, we end up seeing them produce too little and charging a higher price. Okay? So that created a lot of dead weight loss here because of the loss in production. We're no longer producing these units if we have monopoly power, so we've got all this dead weight loss. Relative to this scenario, first of all, before I kind of add something here, any questions up to this point? So what happens if I have markets that are somewhat monopolized, or even monopolistically competitive markets, right? Because monopolistically competitive markets, they kind of have the same thing. They still result in dead weight loss. It's just the companies end up with zero profits, right? But it still ends up, we kind of looked at this a couple classes ago, where we're still not going to get to that perfectly competitive point. Yes, profits are zero in the long run, but we still don't get to this allocated efficient point or the point where a perfectly competitive market gets to. So what if I have a tax in this industry? What's going to happen here? It's the easiest to think about for monopolists. What's going to shift? So we looked at examples with taxes before, and we said it shifted which curve? Yeah, so it shifted my supply curve. But remember, my supply curve reflected marginal cost. The reason why we were focusing on that marginal cost curve for the monopoly, like really, if they're the only firm in the industry, their marginal cost curve is essentially the supply curve. Right? Supply reflected the marginal cost, not of just one producer, but all producers. We only have one producer here. So that marginal cost curve is our supply curve. So what ends up happening with a tax, we can think about, go up even higher. Right? So here is like my marginal cost plus that tax. Right? So already the consumer's being hurt because they're paying this higher price, right? And a bunch of them can't buy the good anymore. So there's all this dead weight loss. A lot of it was from consumers. Our new equilibrium point, well, our marginal cost now includes this value of the tax, right? So that was like a decrease in supply. Or at every quantity, the marginal cost is higher because it now includes this additional tax. Right? So everybody, it's great to tax corporations, right? This is like a running thing you'll hear. Tax the corporations, right? Well, what happens? Our new equilibrium point is where that new marginal cost curve intersects marginal revenue. So with that tax, so we'll kind of call this QM with the tax, right? Well, now the quantity in the market falls even more, and the price they would charge at this quantity would go up to the point that they're at on the demand curve. So now the price the monopolist is charging with the tax has gone up even more, right? And now if you think about consumer surplus, That's the area below the demand curve, but above the price they're paying, or really the difference between their marginal benefit and what their costs are. For the consumer, the cost is the price. Notice we went from, if we were at that allocated efficient point, no taxes, no monopoly power, all of this would be consumer surplus. Now we've got an industry where there's some monopoly power and the government is throwing tons of taxes at this company. Consumers are paying much, much higher prices, and not near as many people are going to be able to purchase this good. So this combination of market power, like the answer to any type of market power, whether it's a monopoly or monopolistic competitive, we just start taxing everything. We start taxing these corporations. All they do is fold that into the price they charge for their good, right? It's going to be higher cost, so they just fold those higher taxes into the price that they're going to charge the consumer. So, I mean, I don't know. I think I got mad the other day listening to something. They're talking about like the answers, let's tax these corporations like they've got all the money. Well, yeah, they're making money, right? So if you're telling me they have positive profits, they must have some monopoly power. So if they didn't have positive economic profits, you wouldn't be that mad about it, right? These industries where they're hyper competitive, nobody's getting mad at those companies. Really large companies that have a lot of the market share, have some monopoly power potentially. Well, they're already charging consumers higher prices. So if you just throw more taxes at them, you think it's going to be good. No, it just increases that price. They're going to charge the consumer even more. And you can kind of imagine here, I guess I didn't do dead weight loss, but now dead weight loss, we're only producing a quantity down here. Dead weight loss grew for this entire area. So kind of combining some things we've talked about in the past with some somewhat more recent stuff with monopoly power, we can see that the combination of these two would be pretty bad for us as consumers. Any questions on this or something else? Yeah. Anything else I could go with here? That's a couple minutes. So what I'll do, since we got a decent number of people here today, I'll be nice, and on your way out, just answer whatever letter so I can get you recorded as being here today. I think what I might start doing also is looking at those exam scores in the next exam and start looking at the correlation with maybe attendance and see what that looks like, just out of interest. So any letter, whoops, is fine with your icon on the way out. Other than that, we'll see you guys on Friday. Okay? Huh? Yeah. Okay, so there's a lot. Prices go up. Wouldn't that encourage either producers or competition? As a price increase, the profit soon. So then corporations like some into play, Wall Street, and free communication in regards to how to reduce marginal costs in order to create. So if you think that, I see what you're saying. So you can see, you think about here, and we don't have any values. So you could come up with some functions here to prove this. I'm trying to imagine before, this was like producing surplus. So that's not synonymous with profit. We don't have our average total cost for it here, but it's a highly correlated. Well, notice after we have that tax, we only have this area. So it's much, I mean, if we had the expectation, we can prove this to ourselves. But the loss, right, that comes from that tax is going to be much more than the gain that we see from having that higher price. So we are reducing profits by this tax. Now, what Lou is saying is a much more complicated model in this class. So if you believe that, I don't know. No, but you're not wrong. So if I can reduce, if this reduction in profits forces these firms to say, well, man, we can't get around paying this tax. We have this higher cost, we have these lower profits. I need to do something. I need to start dumping money into lowering my marginal cost. Right? I need to be innovative to find ways to reduce costs. The problem is, I mean, I don't want to say the problem. In practice, these firms are likely already doing all they can to reduce their costs, right? But your point is not lost, like Andy, because yeah, if that's somehow, if it wasn't a linear kind of response in terms of R&D or whatever to lower costs, if that wasn't a linear response to prices, then potentially that higher price would drive marginal, like these firms to do more, invest more into reducing costs.
It's like,
but if it's optimal to do that, it should have been doing it before.
yeah.
Yeah.
But at the same time, if you're not pressed to do it, because it costs money to innovate, if you don't want to spend the money and you're happy with the profits, then
yeah,
causes you to
but it's the same gain that would now, I mean, it should be the same gain as before, right? So I think what I would argue is the only way in which that happens is if they're waiting, like their perception of the gain would have to be incorrect. Because if it's profitable now to reduce my cost, it would have been profitable before. So maybe I'm just like investigating it more. So like I like the human aspect of it, I think you're right. Right? If we truly had like a perfect idea of where all the cost, like everything would be, then it wouldn't really play a role. But I think you're right. The human aspect of it, this potential could drive us faster.
It's like the hypothetical of switching from manual to mechanical operations. Like, I mean, maybe your marginal costs go down after switching to machines, but the immediate capital you need to switch to that that you could do originally, like in factory terms.
Yeah.
So I don't know. That's just kind of what I.
Yeah. So that's an interesting one. We'll I don't know how. I don't know if we can actually find that next week. Maybe the follow for next year. What that example you just gave is more of like the labor market thing.
Yeah.
Because really what it is it's prices of labor versus capital. So you're right, it's a huge investment to switch over, right?
Yeah.
And potentially they can do it at a lower cost. But as long as I can have really cheap labor, I'm never going to make that investment. The only thing that causes these companies to make that investment is when their costs are getting so higher from labor. But there's a switch between inputs. With the tax, it's not like you're taxing robots but not people, or you're not, you know what I mean? Like
so when you have that monopolistic competition there,
yeah,
and the tax brings us to a point where demand is no longer feasible,